So, guys, listen up. This is where we're at. Today we're going to be continuing Chapter 3. We're going to finish Chapter 3 no later than Friday. We've been here a long time. Our first test is going to be either next Monday or next Wednesday. You're going to have an opportunity to pick when. Yes, sir.
Why is that a quiz on Canvas set for like Thursday?
Don't even worry about it. Here's what happens, guys. Whenever I program my class in, I try to build it to match the syllabus, but we always get behind. And so there's other things that are popping up. We're not there yet, so don't even worry about it. So our test is either going to be on Monday or Wednesday next week, and we're going to vote on that in a minute. Guys, in terms of Lockdown Browser, by show of hands, is there anybody who does not have Lockdown Browser on their computer? Okay, everybody's got it. Good, because they sent it out last week. All right, guys, just a reminder, on the 7th, listen up, guys. Listen up. On the 7th, you have Chapter 3. Your assignment is due. I'm just asking you to tell me in 1 to 2 pages how you would accommodate somebody in the workplace based on a religious requirement. Keep it straightforward. Keep it simple. No citations are even required, though you're allowed to use them. That's due by the 7th. And I got to get that in, guys, because we've got midterm grades due next Friday. So that's why we're in such a rush to get the test on. Guys, we're going to vote on when we're having this test. If it's going to be on Monday or Wednesday next week, I'm asking you to go to this web address, pollev.com/KentTonkin063, and vote for which one you want. Keep in mind, after we get through Chapter 3, we're going to review, and I will be sending you out a review sheet as well. There's also going to be bonus questions on this as well. So vote for the one that you would rather have. Make sure everybody gets a chance to vote. Is there anybody who has not voted? Because right now it's looking like a slam dunk for next Wednesday, which is good. That'll give you guys plenty of time to study. Somebody had to be the opposition. That's okay. All right, guys. Well, the Wednesday voters have it. Our test will be here next Wednesday. It's going to be 50 questions, multiple choice, true and false, and a couple of bonus questions. Now, any bonus points that you have accrued outside of class, I'll be putting those in after we do the test. And by the way, anybody who was in my 203 class, I have to apply your bonus points yet for that class as well. So, yes, sir.
So, did you already figure out what the alternative assignment for the admin speaker could do for traveling on that Friday?
Yeah, I made that announcement in class too. It's the bonus assignment will be, and I will also do this retroactively as well. If you're willing to facilitate a 5 to 10 minute conversation about a topic of your choice, and here's the deal: let's say you do it after midterm, and you want those points to apply to your first test, we can still do that. It just won't show up on midterm grades that way. Good question. Any other questions? Some people are still playing with the survey. That's great. Okay. Guys, before we get into the material today, I had mentioned Flippy in the last class, and so we are going to give you a little video about what Flippy is all about, because we're talking about automation and its effect. On Monday, talking about dating in the workplace, and I would like to hear from you guys. Guys, what is your opinion? Is dating in the workplace acceptable? Yes, sir. So,
If you are still productive and effective at work, there should be no problem.
so as long as people know their boundaries, no problem, right? Yes.
I have to see why that would be a problem. Because like, say like in a fighter zone, you can't work. It can affect your productivity and your attitude towards others.
Especially if you're in the same department of the person you have to fight with.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think it should be allowed between executives and subordinates. But I think if you're in the same level, it should be.
So it's a very good point, because there's an implied power relationship there. So say, for example, if I have a fight with my significant other, who's also my boss, and the next day's performance evaluation time, prospects for me getting a raise are not looking good. Any other opinions here, guys? Yes.
I just feel like us knowing that, not 100% of relationships work out, I feel like it could be like a dangerous is.
No, I
It can be
agree.
dangerous. It can be dangerous. That's what I was saying.
I completely agree. I mean, one of the best parts about something like this, if you're dating somebody in the workplace, actually the best part is you get to see them all the time. The worst part is you get to see them all the time. You know, by the way, that's the best and worst parts of marriage, too, by the way. You get to see them all the time, no matter what. Well, here's what U.S. News says. In terms of the positives are that, yes, you know each other. You have commonality. You got shared history. You also maybe have the chance to revitalize your workday. If you're getting into the workday and you're getting a little blue during the day, you go to lunch with your significant other. The other part of the idea basically is that your significant other understands what your life and your work are all about. They're always around. And some of the negatives are, when does your workday start and end, and when does your relationship start and end? If somebody's working with you, let's say, for example, we've got a number of proposals that are all getting worked on. We're all working on grant or bid proposals. And you're the person evaluating them. And one of the people who submitted a competing proposal is your significant other. How objective are you going to be? On one hand, if you pick that proposal, you're showing favoritism. If you don't pick it, you're going to have a very cold house to go home to if you guys are cohabitating, for example. So, again, the subordinate thing, I think also when we think about breakups, guys, has anybody ever seen a big schism or breakup in their group of friends because two people broke up? Yeah, because we get shared circles of friends. So imagine this, if you're in the workplace, you have two coworkers break up, that's causing potentially productivity issues as well. So how do we handle it? That's a really good question. Basically, some companies have policies, basically where you have to disclose relationships. That varies company by company. So if you are, in particular, dating somebody who is in management, you got to disclose that. I think that discreetness is absolutely crucial in terms of if you're dating somebody in the workplace. Things like, let's be honest, guys, too many public displays of affection are awkward to begin with, or even worse in the workplace. So keeping it discreet, not being Michael, Scott, and Jan, is probably a good way to go. Yes?
But if you put something on Instagram or something, the company fault you for that?
Hence the problems with social media. So give me some context to your example, because it's an excellent point.
Keep it discreet in the workplace for 2 years because you have to, and then when you take a vacation, somebody put a picture on Instagram with them.
The caption said.
The caption says Bora Bora something like that.
That was trash. Bora Bora, my girl.
What you just described, though, was also a plot of the episode of The Office. Yeah. Yeah, except there's a poster and an email and everything else. So I guess here's what the trick is. We haven't really gotten much into social media yet. But check this out, guys. Social media, there are movements to say that should be considered to be protected speech. Right now, it's not. If you, for example, were dating a coworker and you're posting a picture on Instagram and other people see it, you're basically advertising your relationship. If you're breaking company policy and there are penalties to be paid, you could be putting yourself up for a world of hurt. Yeah, it's an excellent point. Other points, guys. I think here's the trick, though. When we think about it, I made this point in a previous class. When you guys get out into your first working jobs, those people you're working with every day, you're going to be spending more time with them than you spend with anybody else in your life. People get close. I can tell you, like in this building, for example, some of my best friends are people who work in these offices here. But when single people start dating and getting involved, it can get awkward for everyone as well. Guys, we're jumping into back to persons with disabilities. You guys remember I had said about how there are challenges in the workforce. I did some research just to get the most recent numbers. And this is how we're stacking up. Basically, it's almost exactly, it's not quite as high as it used to be in terms of double, but it's definitely a higher percentage for persons with disabilities. When we're getting into a sub 4% unemployment rate, and we think that people with disabilities are still dealing with 7.2%, their labor force participation rate is also much lower. People who want to actually get in and are able to return to the workforce. So these folks have a lot of challenges getting even opportunities, getting a chance to be able to be out there with everybody else. So that's why we have so many of these disability laws. Now, in terms of, we talked a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we're going to be talking more about that. But one of the first pieces of legislation that came out to this regard was called the Rehabilitation Act. I mentioned this in my 203 class, but I'll mention it here as well. In 1970s, the early 1970s, the United States was involved in a military conflict. What conflict am I talking about? Vietnam. And so we had large amounts of people who were coming back. At that point, women weren't allowed to serve in combat. That was a different time. But the type of warfare that was being fought, it was the first time Americans had ever dealt with what we refer to as jungle warfare. And one of the very common methods that the Viet Cong would use to take on enemies, they would take large patches of soil and they would put spikes, like wooden spikes, underneath them. If you stepped on the soil, you basically would be impaled on wooden spikes. It was a very agonizing, terrible death, but some people who survived lost limbs. Landmines were a big deal in that war as well, so people losing limbs that way. And we had people who were getting what they referred to back then as shell shock. What do we call it these days? PTSD. So we have PTSD these days. And so what it comes down to basically is we had a lot of folks coming back who needed rehabilitation before they could re-enter the workforce. Here was one of the things too. Why do we have so many more people survive in Vietnam than we did during World War II? What had changed? Yes? You got things like antibiotics, things like better tourniquets and ways to keep people alive. Well, then we ended up in the 1990s with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this basically meant that you could not discriminate against somebody because of a disability, and it applied to any employer who had more than 15 employees. We're going to talk about what this means in terms of reasonable accommodations. For example, if we had somebody who was in a wheelchair, could they have a difficulty being comfortable in this classroom? What might be difficult? Yes? That's exactly right. If you want to know why we have, for example, these desks are higher than the other ones, these are Americans with Disabilities compliant desks. So somebody can come in and be able to use them. So a reasonable accommodation would be if you had persons who were in wheelchairs who had difficulty with mobility, you're making reasonable accommodations by buying a couple of inexpensive tables and making sure that those folks have access. If you want to know how somebody gets classified as having a disability, you have one of these three will give you that criteria. But the first is the idea, do you have a physical or mental disability? Do you have a record of having such a disability, or are you regarded as such? Now you may say to yourself, well, I thought we couldn't treat somebody like they had a disability until they self-identify. That's absolutely true. But in the same token, somebody has to have documentation that they have been regarded by a doctor or by a physical therapist or by somebody with medical training that evaluated them and said they were disabled. So for example, if I came into my employer tomorrow and said, Dr. Fry, I want to report myself as a person with a disability and I want to apply for accommodations, he has every right to ask me for some documentation to back up my disability. So again, even if you've had corrective measures taken, somebody who's lost a leg, for example, and has a prosthetic leg could still be somebody with a disability, could be considered to have a disability. And we're also talking about things like internal body functions. There are people who have disabilities you may not even realize who have disabilities. For example, there are some people who have problems with digestion and have to use external colostomies, for example. It's something nobody ever wants to deal with, but that's a disability. Or if you've got somebody who looks fine on the outside but has a mental disability, that also counts as a disability. So we want to make sure we're including these folks as well. If you have a mental disorder or an anxiety disorder, that can also be considered a person with a disability, but it has to be something that's permanent or semi-permanent. It can't be a temporary injury. For example, if I'm getting headaches because I had a recent concussion, unless that's something that turned into a long-term disability, you cannot claim to be covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The flip side is if somebody's working for you and they are developing a disability while they're there. For example, if somebody falls down these stairs and suffers a spinal cord injury, then that person who maybe didn't have a disability now does. So you've got to accommodate for those persons as well. So employers get into a lot of trouble when they decide they're not going to accommodate, or when they decide to make job requirements that have nothing to do with the actual job. Let me give you an example. If Tabor downstairs decided to leave, if our administrative assistant decided to leave, and we decided to hire a new administrative assistant, let's say we're doing that search. Somebody who works as an administrative assistant, this side of the room, tell me one thing an administrative assistant should know how to do. Somebody who works in an office manager. What's something that somebody there would have to do? What does the secretary do? What do you think?
Maybe copy papers for people.
So you know how to use basic office equipment?
Yeah.
What else? What else would a secretary do? What's a secretary?
Customer service.
So somebody can talk on the phone. Somebody can answer calls. What else?
Some nasty mouse.
Somebody can communicate as the boss wants us to communicate. Keep people organized. All of those things. Well, let's say we're looking at the position description for this job, and we're saying yes, you have to be able to answer the phone. Yes, you have to be able to answer emails. Yes, you have to be able to plan the boss's schedule. Oh, and you have to lift 50 pounds. Is there any conceivable reason why somebody at the front desk on a regular basis would have to be able to lift 50 pounds?
How much is it going to pay for?
Well, that's true. That's a good counterpoint. How often is that person doing it? If it is a marginal job function, if it's something that does not have to do with the core, I would write that term down, marginal job function. If it is not a marginal job function, if you're saying it's a core function of the job, yeah, then it's a requirement. If it's something, for example, it's not part of the core responsibilities, just like we talked about the Hooter waitresses, the idea that looking a certain way doesn't mean you're qualified to work as a waitress. That's when we start getting into discriminatory stuff. So, that's the difference between essential and non-essential job functions. Write this down. Non-essential job functions are also called marginal functions. So a core part of doing your job is your essential job function. For example, my essential job functions, what I'm paid to do is to come into class and lecture, grade papers, and advise students. That's in my job description. The things that are non-essential job functions, if I get asked to judge a dance contest for athletics, for example, that's not part of my essential job functions. We apply that stuff also when we start talking about ADA. So if it is part of your essential job function, if you're the mailman at St. Francis University, you have to be able to lug 100 pounds up a flight of stairs, and somebody who applies for the job cannot do that because of a physical disability, that's not a reasonable accommodation to buy them a robot to do it for you. A reasonable accommodation means you're making a reasonable accommodation that's inexpensive to the employer, reasonable to the employer, and reasonable to the employee. Here's an example. If that same person who got the job as the receptionist had limited mobility in their right wrist and needed an adaptive mouse, for example, they make computer mice that are very easy for persons to use who have carpal tunnel, what does one of those probably cost? $20, $25? That's a reasonable accommodation. That desk that costs probably $100 more than a normal desk, that's a reasonable accommodation. The idea of giving somebody a larger screen if they have visual problems, that also is a reasonable accommodation. Where we get into undue hardship means, let's say, for example, if we said that we're hiring somebody to do this job and they cannot move from the waist down, they want to be that person who's lifting things and carrying things around the mailroom. And they said, well, if you buy me a $2,000 military exoskeleton, like you see in the movie Terminator, I can do this job. That's an undue hardship on the employer. That would be the employer's defense in court if they were sued over not accommodating somebody with a disability. You guys with me so far? Yes?
Is there like a set number, like how much something costs that will make it like unreasonable?
That's-
Because some does unreasonable for like a family business can be way more reasonable for like a family job.
You made an excellent point. And the size and the capabilities of the employer, they are factored into conclusion. There is not a set number. It comes down to if an employee feels that they have not received reasonable accommodation, they can call the Department of Labor, and that's when you usually get the government involved and somebody ends up in court. So it's an excellent point. Yes?
So say someone had that exoskeleton, and the insurer was like, okay, you can do it great, but they didn't realize maybe the exoskeleton needs to be charged or something for a few hours, something like that, or some days they have to go get maintenance on it, so they'll be missing a lot of days work, because they then fire someone based on that.
Or they could choose not to hire them based on, if you could prove that was an undue hardship, that was causing such a strain on your company that you're causing your company to be at peril of losing business, yeah, you could argue that was an undue hardship. Yes?
So if you hire someone in a wheelchair or someone with a disability and you need a ramp for an elevator, would that be under OSHA or would that be
It would be both. And here's the deal. Whenever you get into building codes these days, it's funny because the ramp thing, if you had gone like 40 years ago, that would have been a big deal. basically when the Americans with Disabilities Act came into being, even prior to that, new building codes were basically saying you better have ramps in front of your buildings for wheelchairs. If you also notice too, there has to be what they refer to as one ADA compliant restroom in the building. Do you notice, for example, the restrooms on the bottom floor have a little bit of a wider door in this building? That's why, so they can accommodate a wheelchair. Yeah, so that's a more or less modern building code. Good question though. And in terms of the employer, the size of the employer does matter. Now, that doesn't mean somebody's going to say to Jeff Bezos, you have to create an exoskeleton for this person who's quadriplegic. They also know that there's reasonable expense, period. But the size of the employer is going to factor into it. Good questions, guys. So I'm sorry the print is small, but it's right out of our textbook. Here's some of the ways that we evaluate whether or not something is an essential function. The bottom line is if something is core to the job. If you're a mailman and delivering the mail, that's part of your job. That's what the job is all about. That would be considered an essential job function. If there are a few people who can do the job, if it requires a special degree, for example, if somebody's a child psychiatrist, that's a very specialized degree. So having that degree would be an essential part of the job. If the person who was hired, for example, and one of the few people in the area or in the country who can do the job, their skills and knowledge and abilities can be considered essential. Stuff that are marginal. For example, marginal job functions would be things that are not essential to doing the job. Things that are occasional or not exactly things that we do all the time. In terms of a job function being essential, the bottom line on that also is, if you look back at the people who've done the job before, what have they had to do to make this job successful? What percentage of your time do you spend doing that job? Let me give you an example. If I'm spending the most of my time here as an instructor doing things related to teaching, that would indicate those functions are essential job functions. With me so far, guys? I hate to be repetitive on this, but it's one of these things that is so darn important. When we start talking about the undue hardship thing, again, to answer your question, Corey, it really does come down to a case-by-case basis, deciding something is essential or not essential. I'm going to take a pause for our first question of the day. May I have a question or comment from anywhere in the room, please? Question or comment on this sunny afternoon? Please don't make me randomly call on you. If you have not yet asked a question, today could be the day. In fact, what I say might change your life. You might get that piece of advice today, or that thing that spurs on this idea that causes you to patent a technology that causes you to become a millionaire, in which case you'll come back here, you're going to donate $1 billion to St. Francis and build a building with a giant bat symbol on it. It could all happen because of this conversation. Come on, ask me a question, guys. This could be the best day of your life. Yes, sir.
What's your favorite scene from The Dark Knight?
I think my favorite scene would either be the interrogation scene with the Joker. I mean, it's just so darn chilling. And the very fact when the Joker looks at him and says, "I'm not evil, I'm just ahead of the curve." That's one of the best lines ever in cinema. Although the opening is one of the best scenes in movie history. The bank robber. That catches you from the opening. So, and somebody else has to have a good question.
That's my favorite scene.
Here's a factoid. You see the scene where Heath Ledger is hitting that button and nothing happens?
That was it. It wasn't supposed to be like that, right?
It wasn't. The explosion didn't happen on cue. So when he did the button and did this whole thing, started walking off and exploded, his reaction was real. That really happened. That really happened. I don't know if anybody's making $1 million out of that comment, but yeah, it really happened. Yes, sir.
When is the investment success date?
I think that's due this Friday. Yeah, so if you got an idea, make some moolah, man. I know a lot of people have been talking to me about some killer ideas, none of which I will disclose. But there's some good ideas coming into this one.
Do you know how to log service hours and engage?
I don't, but we're going to have to learn it because we're going to be doing it in this class. Okay, any other questions, guys? Guys, we're going to keep moving. In terms of things and ways that we can accommodate people, let me ask you guys this. In fact, I want to get one comment from each row in this room. What's one way we can accommodate people who have special needs? What's a way that we can accommodate somebody who had a disability to do a job? What's something we can do nice for somebody to make sure that they can do a job, maybe because they've got a physical disability? Think about that for a second. Yes?
Talk with them like you would talk with someone else. Like make them feel that they are normal and they are everyone else.
They can feel included. I love that. What's something we can do to include persons with disabilities? Somebody's got a problem with mobility. What can we do? Say they're in a wheelchair. How can we accommodate them in this room? Elevated desks. Absolutely. What's the way we could accommodate people who maybe have cognitive disabilities? What do you think? Have you ever dealt with somebody with a cognitive disability? Yeah. You're wearing scrubs.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with people who don't remember things?
Keep reminding them over and over.
That's right. So you might have a different way of interacting with somebody. What's the way over here? What's the way we can accommodate persons with disabilities? What's some problem that people have, and how can we accommodate them?
If they have like sensory issues, you could modify like a work schedule so that it works my hours at once.
That's a fantastic answer. And you know who else is doing that, by the way? There's a company called SAP, who is one of the largest programming houses in the world. They're actively recruiting people on the autism spectrum. And the reason they're doing that is anybody, for example, if you've ever worked with somebody who has autism or Asperger's, sometimes individuals on those spectrums have incredible eyes for detail and can make incredibly good computer programmers. So ways that we can accommodate folks. If people have trouble being up during the day, we can give them a modified schedule. If somebody becomes disabled, for example, we need somebody working on the factory floor, let's stick them in the office, let's give them a new job. If somebody has difficulty remembering things, we'll train them more. Or we'll restructure their job so it's easier for them to do things in whatever order works best for them. But we need special equipment, for example. We might buy somebody a special mouse or keyboard. And finally, employer-provided assistance means we might even send them to additional training or counseling so that we can be inclusive to them. So again, what the ADA says to us, bottom line, see what your essential job functions are and see if it's something you can reasonably provide. At this point in time, no employer is getting out of putting a ramp in front of their building. That's something that is just expected. Buying the $5,000 exoskeleton, maybe not. And we also can modify our time for those individuals as well. The bottom line on this stuff too is that you cannot reject somebody flat out just because of their disability. You can reject them for what reason? How can you, if somebody has an apparent physical disability, on what grounds can you choose not to hire them? You're exactly right. You have every right in the world to ask that individual to prove they can do the job. Now, here's the trick, though. If you're asking one person to do it, you better ask everybody. If you have one person who shows up for that warehouse job in a wheelchair, and you ask them to lift 50 pounds, but the last 10 buff people who came in, you didn't ask to prove it, you might be in some hot water. Make everybody do the same thing. And that's only fair anyway. The other thing, too, guys, in terms of ADA, if you've had somebody who's admitted that they are disabled, you cannot really start talking in detail about how their disabilities are going to affect their job function until you've had a conditional offer of employment. In other words, yes, if somebody's acknowledged, I'm disabled, if you ask them to do the test, no problem, you're covered. If you want to really have a detailed conversation about it, you better have a conditional offer of employment before you start asking those questions. Here's the other trick too, guys, and people forget about this as well. You can't ask somebody to do a drug screen either until you have given a conditional offer of employment. If somebody first thing through the door in an interview is asking you to take a P-test, they're technically breaking the law. It happens all the time, but they're breaking the law. And the other thing too, under certain conditions, you can do medical exams prior to employing somebody. The biggest ones I can think of are military, police, anything physical. So any medical information you are storing, though, as an employer, you better store it safely and securely. What law covers that? Anybody know? You may have heard it before. It begins with an H. The Health Information and Accountability and Privacy Act, HIPAA. So in terms of what people have filed charges for in the past, white people have filed charges for disability discrimination. Some folks have filed claims because they were regarded as being disabled. Some folks filed claims, believe it or not, for conditions involved with diabetes. Some people have filed claims that they weren't accommodated for their depression. Other disability, that counts for almost 30%. What that means is people with disabilities have highly individualized conditions. So moving on though, guys. Actually, ADA, we covered that a lot. We covered a lot with that. And I need a second to reset before we get into the genetic bias stuff. So I would like to ask another opportunity for a question or comment before we move to the next section, because we're moving fast today. Question or comment? Sarah.
When we started this, you said that addiction was covered under ADA?
It can be, under certain conditions. Now, say for example, if I were actively using crystal meth and weren't seeking treatment, yeah, because I look like a textbook meth addict. I was 500 times before I started doing meth. It was terrible. Shouldn't make jokes about crystal meth. I apologize for that. But in terms of meth, if I were a meth addict and I'm not seeking treatment, I'm not covered under ADA. If I am a recovering addict and I'm actively in treatment and I'm not using, I could be covered under ADA. Make sense? Okay, and here's the other thing too. There's a bias. Alcohol is generally not covered. So somebody who's a recovering alcoholic is generally not covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Why is that, guys? Why do we view meth and cocaine and all these other substances differently than we view alcohol? I'm sorry? Because it's legal. It's viewed, and I think there's also a social bias there as well. Because if we think about the world of business, one of the stereotypes of the world of business is everybody who works in suits and ties goes out to the bar every night, which there's a lot of truth to that. But I think in terms of social stigma in our country, we don't put the same stigma to alcoholics that we do to drug addicts, even though alcohol is a drug. So, other questions? Guys, this is something that's going to be a very big deal in your lifetime. Right now, in terms of blood screens and urinalysis and all these things, a lot of the times companies want to do genetic screening. They want to do this stuff. Well, actually, let me ask you why. If you're a company, why would you want to do a genetic screening of your employees? If you could, why would you? What can your DNA tell about you? What do you think? Yes? Yep. It's one of these things. Anybody, I asked this before, but just remind me. Has anybody done any of the Ancestry or 23andMe? Has anybody in here done that stuff? I mean, it's fascinating. I'll admit it. It's pretty cool. I did mine, and I was not surprised. Exactly where my parents told me I came from is exactly where I came from ethnically. But the idea, when you get into things like 23andMe, what a lot of these new companies are saying now, we can help you be ready so that if you got a genetic predisposition toward a disease, you can head it off. So let's say, for example, if I've got a genetic predisposition toward a certain kind of cancer, then maybe I want to get more frequent screenings. Employers want to know that stuff because they're saying, how much are we going to pay for health care? Now, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which came out in the 90s, basically said you cannot choose to hire somebody based on a genetic screen. So let's say I do that urinalysis, and I can do a blood test. I'm going in for the state police, and they discover that I've got a high possibility of diabetes and cancer. They cannot choose to not hire me based on that information. I think it's a slippery slope we're walking here, though, because is there a possibility in the future that employers would try to do that? I would say so. Does anybody here know, out of our GDP of $20 trillion a year in the United States, $20 trillion that we have, what percentage of our GDP goes to healthcare? Out of 100%, what percent? How much? You know, we're unhealthy. We're not quite that unhealthy. It's closer to 20. But when you think about it, that means 2 out of every $10 in the United States goes to healthcare. That's crazy. And we spend more, literally we spend more in this country on healthcare than any other country in the world. Yes? Well, it's crazy because our results fall right out in the middle. In terms of we don't have the healthiest population. We've got higher rates of comorbidities, diabetes, cancer, all these industrial diseases. And yet we're spending more than everybody else, but we're not seeing the results. So there's other factors. There's culture, there's diet, all these things. Yes?
That's what I was going to say. We might not be seeing the results because of the other factors. Like we don't take care of ourselves and then expect to make money and they'll be able to take care of us.
We don't want to change our lifestyle, we want to build. We want an instant solution. I don't want to have to go to the gym 5 days a week. I want to take this pill or get this shot and have it be fixed for me. It's definitely part of our culture. But we are spending a lot of money. And the healthcare companies are saying to the employers, you're going to pay a larger premium. And the employers are saying to their employees, if we're paying more, you're paying more. And here's the other trick, guys. The 5% of the sickest people in the country eat up 95% of the resources. So when I say that, one person, because a person, for example, who has problems with obesity, probably is a better candidate for diabetes, probably also has high blood pressure, and probably also has a greater risk of developing cancer. So the sickest people cost us the most. So that's why companies care about this stuff. Speaking of sick old people, in terms of the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, that comes in to protect people like me, saying you can't fire us just for being old, you can't not consider us for being old. Now, you may say to yourself, well, what about the military? They've got age requirements, so does the state police. There are exceptions. And what's the acronym for being able to discriminate when normally you wouldn't be able to discriminate? It's a B, bona fide occupational qualification. The state police would argue that weight, height, and age requirements apply. Here's a fun fact. The United States Navy, you have to maintain height and weight requirements except for one profession in the United States Navy. Can anybody guess what it is? There's one position in the Navy you can be as fat as you want. Take a guess. It's ironic. I'll give you that hint. It's ironic that you can be as heavy as you want in this position. No guesses. Doctors. There's a weight exception for doctors in the U.S. Navy. Can anybody guess why? Because here's what would happen, guys. People would go and go to medical school on the Navy's dime. If you go to medical school on the Navy's dime, they get you for so many years. You have to serve for so many years after you've gotten your degree. Well, what these guys and girls would essentially do, they'd get their degree and they'd be saying, I can make a lot more money in private practice than I can make in the U.S. military. And they literally would eat themselves into being too fat to meet the requirements, so they would get kicked out of the military so they could go into private practice. That is why there's a weight exemption for doctors in the United States Navy. Can't make this stuff up, guys. So it's one of those things, that kind of stuff always shows up as bonus questions, too. I love these little factoids. Guys, in terms of other things, too, we have what we call the Older Worker Benefit Protection Act. And that means, for example, if I'm just saying to you, yes, I'm making a lot of money because I've been here forever, and you want to buy me out because I'm old, you still have to give me some sort of offer in writing. And by the way, it has to be a reasonable offer. So you can buy people out, but it has to be under certain conditions and guarantees. If you ever take a benefits class, they'll talk in depth about this, but it basically allowed buyouts. So how do we manage this stuff, guys? Well, let me ask you, if you had somebody, for example, who's getting older, who's been in a job for a long time, what's the problem for the employee and the employer when an older, experienced person leaves? So we got somebody, let's say we got Sarah and Jack. These guys have both been with the company for 4 years. When they walk out the door, what are some of the problems they experience? What's something that would be tough? I'm sorry? Well, yeah, adapting would be a problem for sure. But I mean, on a personal level, if they're walking out the door after 40 years, what's going to be hard for them? Yeah. So you have friendships. Your work family is another family. So you have that aspect. What else is emotionally damaging to those folks as well? Yes? Routine and a feeling of purpose. And the idea being, it could be on a functional level too. What am I going to do? Is this what happens? Am I going to retire and just fall into nothing? So that's why we oftentimes will do what we refer to as a phased retirement. So we can have those folks generally work their way out. Here's the trick too, guys. When that older male or female leaves the company, is the company losing something too, potentially? Corey, what are they losing, man? You're nodding your head. What are they losing?
They say it's been doing a job for 40 years. Generally, they probably got pretty good at it. They know some ins and outs that someone has just started right now.
That's exactly right. So when somebody who's been with a company forever walks out the door, they lose a lot of that knowledge as well. So the companies have incentives to keep people around and let them ease their way out. And the other thing too, especially in 2008, when we were downsizing, a lot of older folks got recruited back into the workforce to work part-time as well. We're moving in now to religion, guys. We're going to hit this very quickly before the end of our time together today. It's amazing to me how quickly the face of the American public is changing. A little over half of the United States population. Now this stat is a few years old. It's about 2013, 2014 stats. Identifies as Christian. A little over half of the traditional American workforce identifies as either Protestant, Catholic, or Christian. Well, Catholics actually account for another 23%. I misread my diagram. The two fastest growing faiths in the world, and in America in particular, are the Muslim faith and atheism. So these are changing faces. It's amazing when we talk about other faiths too, even though Christianity has many Jewish parts to it. The Jewish faith only accounts for about 1.7 to 2% of the general population. What this means, guys, is in terms of people in the workplace, we're seeing different things than we maybe had seen before. We're seeing, for example, because we have people who practice different faiths, it can be very visual at times too. How do sometimes people give away their faith in the workplace? Yes?
For example, if you're a Christian, like wearing like cross necklace or something.
A lot of Christians definitely wear crosses, gold crosses for sure. If you're wearing a turban, if you're wearing some sort of not protective but covering apparatus, for example, like a hijab, I mean, the requirements of your faith can be very visual at times. And they can also put people up for ridicule, especially when people don't understand somebody else's faith. In our current very divided country right now, this can be tough stuff. Some of the other tough stuff can be how do we accommodate folks who have very specific needs. If you have somebody who practices Islam, for example, you've got to pray multiple times during the day in a quiet room, that can be tough if you're working in a factory. And it's really ironic, too, when you think about women having to wear hair coverings, women who have long hair, or even guys have long hair. A guy who has to wear a beard might be asked to wear a covering over that as well. So on one hand, we got to protect people from discrimination. We have to make sure they're free in expressing themselves, but we've also got to accommodate them. So it could be, for example, accommodation could be giving them flexible breaks. And hopefully you can balance this into a way that balances everybody. Who doesn't like a flexible break? Back in the 70s and 80s, people often took breaks to walk outside and do what? Smoke breaks were the old big thing. And it used to be people who were non-smokers used to get really pissed off because they didn't get those breaks like everybody else did. Well, we eliminated smoke breaks and made it flexible breaks for everybody. Why not do the same thing with religion? Some folks, for example, need to proselytize. That means they need to recruit other people as part of their faith. You have to be careful with that one. If you don't allow one group to recruit, let's say, for example, I run a company, and I'm saying, hey, this group A can have their room for the weekly prayer meeting and to talk and do Bible study. If I deny the same opening for somebody who's Jewish or somebody who's Muslim, I might be engaging in a discriminatory practice. So what you do for one, you have to do for all. Just remember that. Guys, I think that that's a great place for us to stop for today. We're finishing this chapter on Friday. We are going to do a review on Friday, and we're going to do our test when? Next Wednesday. So we're going to be starting the next chapter on Monday, but you'll have extra time to study. Have a great day, guys.